Hey there, my name's Sebastian, and this is Talk.pod, a podcast where I have conversations with some of the most interesting podcasters in the world. My guest today is Abigail Vacca, creator and host of the Global Treasures podcast. It's a show that covers the history, legends, and people that make the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, well, a global treasure. Every week, Abigail examines these sites in an attempt to help her listeners gain invaluable travel tips. Abigail, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Okay, so your podcast focuses on the UNESCO World Heritage Sites. That's obviously a niche in the travel podcast space. I'm wondering what drew you to those sites specifically, and how did you land on that as a theme for your podcast?
Sure. I don't think I will ever get sick of telling the story of how the podcast came to be. So when I was a child, I made a bucket list and I totally forgot about it. Pan forward to 2020, when I, like so many other people, were stress cleaning during the pandemic. Lo and behold, I found the bucket list on a shelf. And I was reading it over and kind of like chuckling to myself, as most of the things I was aiming to do were like learn Japanese, which never happened. But one of the bucket list items was to visit every UNESCO World Heritage Site in the world. I was a big fan of National Geographic magazine when I was young. It was basically my Bible. And obviously, when I was like 8, 9 years old, I didn't understand that there were over 1,000 of these sites, and visiting them could be literally impossible to do. And then I remember showing it to my boyfriend at the time, my parents, my friends, and most of them were like, "What's a World Heritage Site?" And I was under the impression everyone knew what they were because I did. And I kept asking around and I realized, no, people really had never heard of them. So I did further research from there because that's how my brain is. I go down rabbit holes. And I realized that there was a gap in the market. No one was creating podcasts specifically about these incredible places. So I just took it upon myself and my co-host at the time to start Global Treasures.
Fascinating. Yeah, I was a big fan of National Geographic as a kid too. I don't know if you remember, but they used to include like really nice maps that you could pull out and put on your wall. So I took all the maps, all the National Geographics, and my whole bedroom was covered in maps from around the world. But I want to ask you, you're now in season 3, and you've already obviously covered a number of these sites. And as you said, I believe there's 1,248 of them total. So I'm curious how you decide which ones to cover, and is there sort of a method to that selection process?
Great question. So each season goes in order of the year in which UNESCO picks the different sites. So for example, season 1 is 1978, the first year that UNESCO started designating World Heritage Sites. They chose 12 that year, so I cover those 12. And I plan on continuing to do it that way. I feel like it flows well. And it's always interesting though, because some seasons are short as a result, and some years they picked up to 45 sites in a given year. So all of seasons, that could be a year long or longer.
Now, having listened to your show a little bit, I found the way you cover these interesting. You kind of blend history and sort of the legends and fun facts, and you've got sort of practical travel tips as well. And I'm curious what your research process is like, and how long it usually takes you to get ready for one episode.
Yeah, it really depends. Some episodes focus on the smaller or lesser known sites, like Abu Maina in Egypt often comes to mind, or Ernst Stave Church, where we don't necessarily know as much about the history. So there might not be as much that I can speak to on that piece.
Right.
On the other hand, researching a site like I recently did the Historic Center of Rome, that was so tough because there were so many interesting tidbits about the history, a million travel tips I could have given because it's such an old city.
Yeah.
I actually thought about doing a two-parter, but I decided not to. So I say all of that because it took me literal hours trying to cut it down to 30 minutes or less. And it's also much easier to write an episode on a site like that where I have visited.
Right.
So
Of course.
all in all, yeah, it probably takes 4 to 6 hours on average to prepare for recording.
Yeah. I've also seen you say that you believe that, we can become better humans when we learn more about other cultures, other places. Has researching and sort of hosting this podcast changed you in any meaningful way? Is there maybe one particular UNESCO site that has shifted your perspective on something?
Absolutely. Researching these sites, I feel, has made me more humble, more open-minded, and really allows me to see these sites through, I'd say, more of a cultural lens without judgment. I think it's one thing to see a photo of a place on Google, and it's another to actually be standing in front of Stonehenge.
Of course.
That's the site that came to mind for me when you asked that question. And you really are like, wow, the grit that must have been required to build this before modern technology, incredible.
Yeah.
Culture is not a static monument. It's a living, breathing negotiation, if you will, between humanity and time and history. And I think travel forces you to trade your assumptions for, my background's in social work. So I think about active listening, replacing the us versus them narrative with more of that firsthand account or understanding of our shared humanity. And I would also add that Stonehenge specifically really shifted my perspective on something being food, which might sound strange, right? But I was researching the food throughout England, and I didn't realize that there are so many regional variations. Again, I made assumptions, and I always thought that I wasn't really as adventurous palate-wise as I thought. But then once I started traveling more and more, instead of like ordering a hamburger, which I was never really one of those tourists. I was a little more adventurous, but I found myself just kind of going back to the old usuals. I started just going to restaurants and being like, give me your most popular dish. But now if I see bugs or a type of meat I've never tried, I'll order it. And I say all of that to say that might seem like a strange tangent, but I think just immersing yourself in the culture and being brave is so important.
Yeah. Now, some of the sites that you cover, like Garamba National Park in the DRC, are probably places that a lot of listeners might not be able to go. I mean, for safety reasons, there's all kinds of travel advisories. I wonder how you think about that in terms of serving your listeners and your audience who, on the one hand, they want to learn about these sites, they want to be inspired, versus ones that are sort of, actively planning a trip.
Yeah, I get asked this a lot, and I always say I kind of view myself as what I hope is a curator of wonder while also being a steward of practicality. I really feel like the way I serve different kinds of listeners is through what I call realistic storytelling. Because you're right, for a site like Garamba, the value isn't just in the physical visit, it's just understanding why it exists. So I want to transport people through time, diving into that historical piece so they can appreciate the site's universal value, if you will, and the importance of preservation, even if you're thousands of miles away. But then for the avid traveler, I'm guessing those who listen to my podcast tend to be planners like me. So I try to focus on the how. And I'm incredibly transparent about travel advisories, logistical hurdles, if you will. and the ethical footprint of visiting a more sensitive area.
Mm-hmm.
I don't sugarcoat it, which I've gotten feedback about, but I'm always going to try to provide the context needed to visit with respect while also being safe.
Is there something you've learned about your audience from the kinds of episodes that they respond to most? I mean, as you know, most podcasters, you're probably looking at your analytics and you know your audience pretty well. So yeah, I'm curious, what kind of episodes tend to resonate the best?
Honestly, in terms of length, shorter
Mhm.
episodes seem to resonate. And I respect that because I think we're all so short on time. We need something quick and easy to digest sometimes.
Yeah.
And I've learned that my audience is very impressive. They're deeply intellectually curious. And I find that the episodes that get the most listens are often those that delve into a mystery or they provide the why behind a destination's culture. So I think it's beyond like they don't want to just know where to eat in Malta. They want to
Hmm.
know how the landscape influenced the city's culture.
Is there a UNESCO site you think is still sort of underrated, even amongst experienced travelers?
I might be biased as a proud American, but I hear a lot of people say that Independence Hall in Philadelphia is overrated.
Mm.
Like, oh, it's just a historic old building, not that exciting. And for some of the sites that I consider underrated, again, I'm
Mm.
always going to say part of it is understanding the context. Like, I understand it isn't physically grand, like when I visited the Vatican and I saw the Sistine Chapel. But Independence Hall is the birthplace of one of the most powerful countries in the world, where the Declaration of Independence was signed. I mean, I remember walking the building and thinking to myself, I'm walking the same ground George Washington once did. I mean, for me, if that's not impactful, I don't know what is.
Yeah, incredible. You've obviously done a lot of research, read a lot about these UNESCO sites. Is there one of them that sort of has the most interesting or kind of best mythology or legends that's attached to it?
A lot of them do. I think for me, it's always the Yeti in Kathmandu Valley. And for anyone listening who doesn't know what the Yeti is, many people know it as the abominable snowman. So it's like supposedly this ape-like creature that walks on two legs and lives in or near the Himalayan mountains. And according to Nepali legend, it's actually a spiritual guide, and on the other hand, like a feared monster. So it's a lot like the Bigfoot that we have in the United States. But I've always thought cryptozoology is incredibly fascinating. And
Hmm.
a lot of these legends really come from, again, the cultural context. And I always think of this site because I think it's fun that the country actively embraces it.
Hmm.
So, like, the Nepalese government officially uses the Yeti for national branding, and they even have Yeti Airlines. I think that's so fun. So, I always
That's fun, yeah.
I always appreciate when the folklore gets woven into tourism and the economy.
Mm. Yeah, I didn't know that. That's interesting. I want to switch gears a little bit and just talk about, what you've done to promote the podcast and what you've had success with. You're obviously active on a range of platforms, social media channels, but you've also maintaining a travel blog and you've got a mailing list as well. And obviously, that's a lot of, that's a serious content operation. How do you manage it all?
Honestly, probably not enough sleep, but it comes down to being really disciplined with my calendar.
Mm.
And I view my social media, my blog, my mailing list as one single task rather than separate tasks.
Sure.
So it's nice that I can easily repurpose content too. So a podcast script for a site becomes the outline for a blog post, which I can then slice into facts I use as social clips. So that way the story kind of tells itself across every channel. I really try to stay organized too by dedicating specific days to recording. I think it's really important to be in tune with yourself and know when you sound best, when you're the most energized. I do best when I record in the mornings, whereas I tend to record for social media at night.
Interesting. Now, I don't know if you agree with this statement, but I think that travel podcasting is fairly crowded, just like many other podcasting categories. What do you think helps your podcast stand out, aside from the fact that it sort of has this narrow focus?
I think what we've been speaking to, and that it is beyond the traditional travel content. So I feel many travel podcasts solely focus on itineraries and hotel recommendations, whereas I really try to get into the deeper stories behind these places. So I'm combining the history, the culture, the mythology, the conservation, and that practical travel advice. And I feel like it's a unique framework for telling a story about environmental preservation and the shared global heritage. So by highlighting both what I'll call the more iconic landmarks like Grand Canyon and those lesser known destinations, I feel like listeners are getting education and maybe a more emotionally engaging experience than other travel podcasts might provide.
Mm-hmm. Have there been any episodes that have sort of surprised you in terms of exploding in popularity compared to the others?
One of the more recent episodes I did, which is Ouro Preto, has been doing unexpectedly well. That was an episode I released, and I expected maybe just 30, 40 listeners. And for those who don't know, this was a Brazilian site, and it was the center of their gold rush. And it was even a UNESCO site I had never heard of, to be honest. And so again, I just figured the same for listeners. So I don't know if that's the reason it's popular or because it seems to be a site that there aren't really many, if any, other podcast episodes on.
During the course of your podcast, you've been doing it for a little bit now. Have there been any particular marketing and promotion tactics that have worked best for you, whether it's, short form clips, social media, email, guest appearances on other podcasts?
I think a mixture of all of the above. Interviews like this, social media posts, especially on Facebook and TikTok. I've never done well on Instagram. When I post on TikTok, there are times when my numbers in other countries go way up that day. It's really interesting, even if the video only gets 700 views. And I also try to do interviews with local news stations and newspapers.
That's an interesting tactic. And when you mean local ones, you mean wherever the site is located, yeah?
Wherever the site is located, I try to reach out to cultural centers sometimes.
Okay.
Even throughout the United States, I'll let them know, hey, I just dropped an episode on this site. I thought that your newsletter followers might be interested. So sometimes they'll even post it on their Facebook page too, which I really appreciate.
That's cool. Yeah, that's a tactic I'd never thought of. That's pretty awesome. Okay, now, I still think, I run a podcast discovery newsletter, which is sort of designed to kind of bridge that gap of, trying to surface podcasts for people that, they would never otherwise know because the big platforms don't feature them. They're still not that great at sort of the editorial work of promoting podcasts. And so I still think that word of mouth is still one of the most powerful discovery tools for podcasters. What do you think makes listeners actually, tell a friend about a podcast like yours, about, global treasures? And have you ever been surprised by the way somebody has discovered your show?
I have actually asked listeners, and I've been told that they share with friends who they feel are armchair travelers. And that makes me so happy because that's how I started marketing the podcast. So it sounds like they share the show because it provides again, that interesting information and hopefully helps them become better, more informed tourists. I think the most interesting way someone found the show. So I noticed we had high numbers in a state where I didn't know anyone. I wasn't actively promoting the show to like cultural centers in that state. So I couldn't figure it out. And it turns out that there was a pretty big women's book club who one of the members read a book on a UNESCO site, Googled it, and found my podcast, started listening, and she told the whole group about it. So they started listening to various episodes and discussing it. I thought that was so neat.
Wow. That is neat. Yeah, that's random. That definitely qualifies in the strange way to have your podcast discovered. If you could sort of get access and wave, a magic wand to get access to a tool or piece of software that, makes the production and promotion of your podcast much more effective and easier, what do you think that tool would do?
If I could invent software that could automatically edit my videos, post them on platforms with like the perfect SEO or hashtags to make sure
Right.
the algorithm pushes me out there, that would be incredible.
Yeah. It's a lot of work, isn't it?
It is. Upping my social media game is something that I would really like to work on in 2026.
Yeah. Now, the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, I think they exist partly to spotlight places that are at risk of being lost in one way or another. Whether it's through war or climate change or neglect or tourism. Do you feel any sense of responsibility as a content creator to address some of those pressures? Or do you sort of worry about popularizing a site that could sort of contribute to the very problems that are threatening it?
Very much so. So I mentioned before, I actually have a master in social work degree, and social and environmental justice are things that have always been very deeply important to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I know sometimes if you listen to my episodes, I sound like a broken record because I'm always saying, make sure you clean up after yourself if you're hiking in a national park. Don't leave trash behind, the animals could eat it. Don't try to approach or feed the animals. I think it's a catch-22 because tourism can cause sites to deteriorate, but without the tourism dollars, often the site isn't kept up anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that, I think a lot of people don't realize that there are people living at some of these sites. Like they're towns where, you're leaving trash in someone's home. So I think if we're thoughtful and responsible stewards of the site, we can have it both ways. But yes, I always say I feel very protective of them, like they're my children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's understandable. Do you think podcasts sort of have a unique place to play in surfacing some of these cultural stories? Because, we're living in this culture now that is very, very short attention spans, and the sort of way people are consuming a lot of media is it's these short form platforms, clips. But I still feel like podcasts kind of offer that kind of long form conversation that's so badly needed. Do you think that's true?
I would say definitely. You can't just scroll through mindlessly. Like, again, if you're on TikTok, you really have to dedicate a period of time. It might be only 10 minutes, but some podcasts are 1 to 2 hours long, right? And I think it's more active versus the passive listening because you really have to digest the storytelling. Plus, I think people are more apt to choose to listen to episodes based on something they want to learn about versus the mindless scrolling. So there's the educational piece, and I think it keeps them more involved.
Yeah, and I think podcasting also sort of tends to foster an intimacy between host and listener that you don't get with other media, at least not often. Have you experienced that with your listeners, who feel like they genuinely know you? And how does that change how you think about the responsibility of what you say and how you say it?
So sort of like that parasocial relationship thing.
That's right.
I have to keep in mind that my voice is often riding alongside when people are driving to work, or maybe they listen to the podcast while walking after work to de-stress. I always feel pressure not to disappoint people. And I also feel a sense of responsibility to be accessible, to give suggestions or answer travel related questions.
Mm.
That being said, I'm not a travel agent, and I've kind of had to set boundaries because I've also had people circle back to me who are upset because they didn't like their visit to a certain World Heritage site. So I'm always
It's all your fault.
careful.
It's all your fault, Abigail.
Exactly. They didn't like Stonehenge. They were bored. So now I try to be careful and always reiterate, I'm not giving you advice. These are just my thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, I asked this question of a lot of other podcasters also because I feel like, first of all, I think podcasters are often very heavy podcast consumers themselves. I don't know if that's true for you, but I'm curious what you think about, the broader podcasting landscape. Where does podcasting go from here? Is it going to continue to grow and influence? Are we approaching a saturation point? I see a lot of people online say, that's enough. We don't need more new podcasts. Not everybody has to have their own podcast. What does that sort of mean for independent creators and podcasters or podcasters that are just starting out?
I mean, I have mixed feelings about that because I know they say there are over 3 million podcasts out there, but I think only 20% or so are actually making fresh episodes.
I think it's even less than that.
Exactly. So I think, yes, we are at the saturation point, but I think right now, the current focus and battle is video versus audio only podcasts.
That's right.
Because I know a lot of hosts are struggling to decide whether or not to transition, myself included. And ultimately, I think the fact that the Golden Globes, for example, added a category for podcasting says that it will continue to grow in influence, especially since so many public figures now have a podcast.
Yeah, and just pulling more on the sort of video versus audio thread, because you're right, it's a huge topic of conversation in the podcasting world right now. And there's this tension, right? Podcasters want to have their podcast discovered, but one of the best way to have them discovered nowadays, at least, is through video, through YouTube, again, through all these short form clip platforms. And of course, the tension there is that, okay, great, I want to have my podcast discovered, but that adds a huge amount of new work on top of editing just audio, right? This is a video podcast we're on right now. I can, going through the editing process, I think the audio, if I was only to have this as an audio podcast, would probably cut out at least, 60 to 70% of the actual editing work. I'm wondering how you feel about that tension.
Well, given I am a one-woman show, that is part of why I have not transitioned. I'm not opposed to it, but it is me doing, like you said, all of the research, all of the writing. I record myself, I edit, and I am really neurotic. So I edit in Audacity and then Auphonic and then Descript because I want it to sound good. And I'm like, imagine if I added video to that.
Mm-hmm.
That would be heavy.
Yeah, it would, for sure. Okay, Abigail, final 2 questions. What are 3 podcasts you'd recommend?
Ooh. I would say Crime Junkie. I'm sure a lot of people pick that, but I do like a good crime story. And sometimes they touch on crimes in UNESCO World Heritage Sites like national parks. My second choice would be If Books Could Kill, where Michael Hobbs and Peter, I think it's Shamshiri, talk about airport books, and it is hilarious. And then the third choice would be the OG, the podcast that got me into podcasts, and that is Stuff You Should Know. And a big thank you to Chuck and Josh for getting me through the pandemic.
Yeah, all 3 of those podcasts are excellent. And where can people find you online?
You can find Global Treasures on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, any major platform, and my blog is on globaltreasurestravel.com.
Excellent, Abigail. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you again for having me.
Of course. All right. Thanks for listening to this episode of Talk That Pod. Make sure to follow us on all the social places. Just search for Talk That Pod. And if you're not subscribed yet, this podcast is also available on YouTube at Talk That Pod Show. Also, if you liked what you heard, tell your friends about it. And if you really liked it, give us a follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. And if you're a podcaster who wants to come on the show, go to talkthatpod.net and submit a request. Finding great podcasts is hard. That's why you should also check out Find That Pod. It's a podcast recommendation newsletter I write every week, bringing you 5 amazing new podcasts you should listen to. Subscribe today at findthatpod.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.